So while we've touched from time to time on geopolitics, that doesn't mean we have said it all. This session will focus on the delicate diplomacy between China, Russia, Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world, the really important perspective of the global South or other developing countries in this, particularly in crafting a new world order. Panelists will consider how the war in Ukraine has affected the global order and how Russia's invasion has the potential of exacerbating deep tensions in the post-Cold War order. And we have three of our panelists today are with us via Zoom. The musical chairs, including the Zoom seat, continues to affect us all. We are thrilled to have Charlottesville native Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is the CEO of the New America Foundation. And from 2009 to 2011, she served as the Director of Policy Planning at the Department of State. Prior to her government service, Dr. Slaughter was the Dean of Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, and before that, a law professor at Harvard. Patricia Kim is a David Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings John L. Thornton Center on China, where she specializes in Chinese foreign policy and U.S.-China relations. She's previously served at the U.S. Institute of Peace and has been a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and at Harvard's Belfer Center. Tomas Risa is a professor and chair of Transnational Relations, Foreign Policy, and Security Policy at the Otto Suhr Institute for Political Science at the Free University of Berlin. This session will be moderated by John Owen, who is a UVA professor of politics, author of numerous books on international relations, and a senior faculty fellow here at the Miller Center. And he'll be joined in particular by, including the rest of the war room, but by Professor Dale Copeland, another professor of politics and senior fellow at the Miller Center, and former ambassador and current vice provost for global affairs, Steve Mull, also a Miller Center senior fellows and other from our war room. So John, over to you.
Good, thank you, Bill. Thanks to all our panelists zooming in from hither and yon, some accommodating themselves to our Eastern time zone. This is quite an array of talent, wisdom, and experience we have. The panel is titled, the session is titled China, Russia, the United States, and a New World Order. A New World Order is a serious claim. It's one we've heard before. Rather than hit that claim head on, whether there's a new world order, if there is, what it looks like, let's approach the question indirectly from various angles. The new world order phrase comes up because Russia's war in Ukraine really is exceptional in the modern world. It's a kind of an earthquake. I want to take a minute just to remind us of how important this is. It's the biggest war in Europe since 1945. It's the most audacious seizure of territory by force since that war. It's a flagrant violation of international law. In terms of geopolitics, the balance of power, that has yet to be worked out. Maybe we can talk about that in the coming minutes. But Russia is asserting its power, seeking to increase it, to show that it belongs in the rank of great powers. It has thus far de facto added to its territory, as it did in 2014 when it annexed Crimea. At the same time, Russia has also exposed itself as weaker militarily than we thought. It's losing the war, being driven to more and more desperate measures, which we're all thinking about. That leads to another important angle. The war puts the world in more danger of a wider war involving the United States, perhaps, danger of nuclear weapons being used, something most of us academics who study international relations don't think is very likely, but something whose probability is above zero. I have a question for each of our panelists, really a cluster of questions for each. So let me start with Tomas Risa in Berlin. As follows, Tomas, political unity among the Western countries, and this came out in an earlier session, and unity among other wealthy democracies, including Japan and South Korea, has been impressive since the war began. The economic sanctions imposed on Russia are like nothing we've seen. Western unity has been identified as crucial to the war, rightly so. How much staying power does this unity have, do you think? How does it look from where you're sitting in Berlin, Thomas? If you could speak for Germany, for Europe, and then more broadly for the West. How do you read public opinion on the war and any shifts on this front? What are the ramifications of all of this? So please.
Thank you. Can people hear me? All right. So I'm actually not sitting in Berlin. I'm in a hotel in Potsdam, so close by. And I can certainly not claim to be the spokesperson for the West here. So anyway, but thanks for the invitation. So staying power. I think at the moment, so far, so good. And I want to highlight one thing. These sanctions are costly for Europe. They're really costly. I mean, we are facing an energy crisis. Okay, this is all of, we can talk about the causes for hours. This is all of our own doing. We made ourselves way too dependent on Russian gas and oil, so that's okay, all okay. But we are facing a serious energy crisis, probably followed by a recession. Despite all this, the support level in public opinion for the support for Ukraine is still very high. Also, what I would say, there's a very high level of solidarity with Ukrainian refugees. So in Berlin alone, and Berlin is one of the smaller places for the refugees. I mean, Poland really bears the brunt here. Berlin alone has 200,000, has taken in 200,000 Ukrainian refugees by now. My own universities, we have all scholars at risk. By the way, also from Russia by now, Russian dissidents coming over and academics, etc. So in that sense, we do feel the cost of the war, and despite all that, the support level is still pretty high. I would say one decisive factor for all of this is what happens on the ground in the battlefield. As long as people perceive the situations thus such that Ukraine has a real chance to fight this out, as long as that is the case, my suggestion would be that also public opinion and then following the political elites will continue to support this. So, in fact, developments on the battlefield are directly related to the unity and support of the West. Of course, I can't talk about the United States here. You do see certain cracks, and we don't know what happens after the congressional elections. Maybe Anne-Marie can comment on this. But my sense is, I mean, to cut this short, my sense is that the European support so far is surprisingly high. Actually, I was surprised by this, I have to say.
Good, thank you. Next, I want to go to Anne-Marie Slaughter. And at an earlier session this morning, questions about U.S. involvement and ultimate goals were discussed. The United States is not a direct belligerent, but of course is deeply involved politically in intelligence terms, particularly in supplying crucial military hardware and lots of it. What is America's, as you see it, what's America's purpose in supporting Ukraine? What ought it to be? What do you think the Biden administration wants to see at the end of this war?
So thank you. Thanks, John. And it's great to be here. I have to start just by saying, I think probably not alone, but I'm one of the few people here. I grew up with Bill Battle. He was the partner when my father was an associate in what was McGuire Woods and Battle, and his daughter Janie is my oldest friend in the world. And Barry Battle, I know Barry and Janie are both listening. So I just have to start with a tribute to Bill Battle, who was a real force in my life growing up. And I so wish that I could be at the table with all of you. I'll be in Charlottesville over the weekend, but I couldn't make it today. So the United States' purpose is twofold. It is to uphold the cardinal principle of the United Nations Charter, Article 2.4. It's the foundation, which is that all states will refrain from the use or threat of force against the political independence or territorial integrity of any other state. And this is as blatant a violation of that principle as you can have. Russia is saying it's not, that Ukraine is not a politically independent state, that it's part of Russia, and it has invaded and is trying to conquer its territory. So if the world order that we have means anything, it means that one nation cannot just invade another, which was not true for most of history. I mean, the United Nations Charter really did establish that as a fundamental rule of international law, and it's kind of an anchor. Now, there are countries in the world who would say the United States has definitely broken that same article in various ways. I'm not going to get into that now. But so the first point is, if we're going to have rules that mean anything, you have to hold the line on this one. The second, though, is that the United States sees itself as leading a coalition of democracies versus autocracies. And it's just released its national security strategy. And in that strategy, on the geopolitical side, because it looks at geopolitical threats and global threats, but on the geopolitical side, it is a division in the administration's view in the world between democracies and autocracies. So those are the two purposes, and that means we will fight, and in my view, should fight at least to recover the territory that Ukraine had at the outset in February 2024, and to be negotiating over the rest of it. And probably to go back to have all of the Ukraine as of 2014, when Putin did this initially, but I'm not sure about the Crimea. The administration wants to fight this war without escalating it with Russia. That's why Russia keeps threatening things like a nuclear weapon, because Russia would prefer to try to escalate it and then to force a settlement. The last thing I'll say, though, is I don't think the rest of the world does see this as a battle of democracies versus autocracies. And many of the countries that the Biden administration has assiduously cultivated, countries like India and Brazil and South Africa, they are not lining up with us against Russia and then China on the side. They have other issues that they are facing, wars like the war in Ethiopia, other kinds of conflict, but even more dramatically, the impacts of climate change. Pakistan is a third of Pakistan is underwater. So I understand and agree with what the administration is doing in Ukraine, but I don't agree with the frame of democracies versus autocracies. And I don't think the majority of the world outside Europe and the United States and Canada think that's what the chief global issue is.
Good, thank you, Anne-Marie. A question for Patricia Kim. Whenever we talk about global politics today, we have to talk about China. At the recent 20th Party Congress, it was evident that Xi Jinping is going to continue to consolidate power. Also, he used some rhetoric that many interpret as preparing the party and the Chinese nation for storms ahead. So a couple of questions here. How far has the Russian war in Ukraine, affected the dynamics of the Russian-Chinese relationship? And how far has the war affected the U.S.-China relationship? If you could take those in turn. I know they're related, but I wonder if you could take those in turn.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you, Bill and the Miller Center, for inviting me to the symposium. I wish I was there in person, but it's great to be able to join virtually for this timely conversation. So the war in Ukraine has certainly put a spotlight on China's ties with Russia, and in turn impacted American and global views of China. And so to back up a bit, the China-Russia strategic relationship, it didn't spring up overnight. It's been deepening over the last decade across the economic, political, and military domains. And this has been really striking to watch, because Just a few decades ago, these two states considered each other their biggest rivals. And their strategic partnership today is underpinned by shared grievances vis-a-vis the West. Now, this partnership was thrust into the limelight earlier this year when President Xi made the fateful decision to host Putin at the opening of the Beijing Olympics, and the two sides released a joint statement in which they declared a no-limits partnership just 20 days before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since February, Beijing, despite multiple opportunities, has been unwilling to explicitly condemn Russia's war of aggression, and its decision to double down, at least rhetorically, on its alignment with Moscow has raised grave concerns about China's strategic intentions and its long-term outlook. And it's brought global scrutiny and urgency around the situation in the Taiwan Strait, which is not in Beijing's interest. And so this raises the question of why has Beijing not distanced itself more from Moscow despite the diplomatic costs? And I think there are several reasons for this. And this gets to your first question about, Xi talking about sort of bracing for tensions to come. So first, I think it's clear that Chinese leaders see direct parallels between Russia's predicaments and their own. They see NATO enlargement and the strengthening of the US alliance network in Asia as forms of Western encirclement. And so they see Russia as an important partner in pushing back against this. Second, Beijing doesn't want to make an enemy of its nuclear power neighbor, Russia, and to be bogged down with a rivalry as it was during the second half of the Cold War. And relatedly, China wants as many strategic partners as possible as it looks at long-term competition with the US and its allies. And again, it sees Russia as an important great power partner in pushing back on what it sees as a Western-dominated global order, Western-dominated financial system, and Western sanctions and values and so on. And finally, I think the fact that Xi Jinping has personally invested in his relationship with Putin makes it difficult for the Chinese political system to say, hey, maybe Xi was wrong, and to roll this back. I mean, Xi has met with Putin, I think something around 39 times since he came to power in 2012, which is quite remarkable. Now, I do want to note that despite the very close ties between the top leaders, Beijing's behavior since February, not so much the rhetoric, has been not as enthusiastic as we would think one would be in a so-called no limits partnership. So there are indeed some limits. So Beijing has said that it does respect territorial integrity and sovereignty without explicitly condemning China. It has said that it will continue normal trade with Russia, but at the same time, it hasn't provided weapons or extended direct assistance to Russia's military efforts. And Chinese banks and businesses have also largely complied with sanctions, although we've seen a boost in energy trade with China replacing Germany as the largest importer of Russian energy. So I think all of these choices suggest that while Beijing wants to maintain its ties with Russia for the reasons that I laid out earlier, it also doesn't intend to severely undercut its own interests to help Putin wage his war against Ukraine. Let me stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I have sitting to my left, Brantley Womack, another China scholar, and I wonder if I can call on you, Brantley, to talk about the limits to China's support for Russia in this war. How, for example, we've heard over the course of the morning, some fairly robust goals attributed to the United States for the outcome of the war. Can the United States and China, let's say, as the two greatest of the great powers, come to some kind of consensus about what the end of the war should look like?
Well, thank you. I think one thing that there's a consensus on, though neither side is able to do much about it, is I think both would like to have the war be as short as possible. The question is, as possible. Does that mean an indefinite stalemate, or does that mean, what does that mean? Some sort of compromise? I don't think victory, meaning a unilateral imposition by force of the preferences of one side over the other side and having that stand as a definitive conclusion, I don't see that as likely. And I doubt if the Chinese would see that as likely. Are they happy about the war? I would say definitely not, because it adds confusion. Consider how important the growth, its participation in a globalized world economy was. I mean, the problem to some extent, the problems that China has now with the American participation in the global order is that it's limiting the global order, the permissiveness of the global order that was so important to China. So those are the concerns. Containment of China is its concern, not global order versus some sort of China-led disorder. So I don't think the war is something to its interest. And let me get to a very specific issue that I think would be a difference between China, a common interest between China and the United States, and a difference with Russia and Putin, and that is nuclear weapons and the possibility of use. I'd like to point out that last week there was a very interesting argument by a Chinese military public face in Financial Times, arguing that China should break its appearance of neutrality in the conflict and come out very strongly against any use of nuclear weapons by Russia. And I think that was something that would not have been forward unless that was within the scope of central opinion in the Politburo, and something that she was considering at raising as an issue. And I think this could be an opportunity for U.S.-China cooperation, because we don't want nuclear weapons used. The Chinese don't want nuclear weapons used. Think of how that would confirm the split of Eurasia into Europe and Asia. Think of, and for China, the Belt and Road Initiative, that whole thing about Eurasia and connectivity all the way to Duisburg in Germany, that's very important. So I just want to bring that up because it's a new issue that I haven't seen publicly recognized, that this is some type of trial balloon, at least on the part of the Chinese. In general, I think the Chinese want to not appear to be on one side or the other. I think to some extent the presentation in Western media of China being on the Russian side is exaggerated. As we just heard, the Chinese have actually been more cautious in their practical behavior, and they've always said that they support the UN provisions on no invasion of sovereign countries. And incidentally, it should be remembered that doesn't necessarily prevent use of force in Taiwan, because Taiwan is not recognized as a sovereign country. So let me stop there. I'm sorry. It's starting to go on so long.
Not at all, Brent. That was important to say. There's a lot on the table. It's hard to know how to sequence it, but let me do this. Let me bring it back. I see Steve Mull across from me to what Tomas Risa was talking about earlier. Solidarity and how the West, especially Europe, is hanging tough, although there are difficulties. It's quite costly. You were an ambassador, U.S. ambassador in that part of the world, Eastern Europe. I wonder how this looks to you, the solidarity question. Let me throw in populist parties, some of which have a different attitude toward Russia and Ukraine. So if you could speak to that, please.
Sure. Thanks, John. And it's great to be here with so many former colleagues like Eric and Heather, my former boss when I was ambassador to Lithuania, and great to see Anne-Marie Slaughter again on the screen. Thanks very much. I have to say NATO certainly was going through some difficult times over the past few years, whether it's about burden sharing, some of the fairly aggressive statements from the Trump administration about the future of NATO, and the wayward path of countries like Poland and Hungary on human rights and rule of law concerns over the past few years, all exercised quite a few tensions on the alliance. I'm hesitant to take joy out of such a horrible, tragic situation as this invasion of Ukraine, but there are some good things that have come out of it on that particular front. I spent many years working in Poland. I can tell you, I never, up through the time I left there as ambassador in 2015, never had a single conversation, serious conversation about European security issues without the mention of the word Yalta, and that the United States was going to betray Poland. We talked a good game about supporting democracies, building a community of mutually defended democracies, but that the history of the United States guarantees, they worried that they couldn't count on that. And repeatedly, when it came to the macro questions of European security, such as missile defense, procurement, certainly, there was a belief among many in Central Europe that U.S. policy, that the deciding factor was how would Russia react, or before it, how would the Soviet Union react? And Russia, as a nuclear power, had to occupy more of our sensitivity than the security needs of relatively smaller countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and others. That has changed. I think the Biden administration's response has won huge plaudits throughout Central Europe. It wasn't necessarily going to be that way. I remember after the 2020 election, President Duda in Poland took many, many weeks before he issued congratulations to President-elect Biden, the parliamentary leader of the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Even a month after the election, was broadcasting on social media pictures of Joe Biden visiting his son's grave in the cemetery with the caption, "Here is Joe Biden thanking all of his voters in the election." So promoting this view that somehow Biden had won the election by fraud, which is astonishing that the parliamentary leader of a country that relies exclusively on the United States for its security guarantee shows how troubled and dysfunctional the relationship could have been. I was in Poland a few months ago. I'm happy to say the word Yalta did not come up once during the conversation. There was nothing but praise and gratitude and trust that the United States, in fact, does mean what it says and would abide by its Article 5 commitments under the North Atlantic Charter. So I think it's been a good news story. I think the Ukraine conflict, moving to broader geopolitics beyond Europe, also opens up some other interesting new opportunities for the United States. In the Middle East, for example, one of the things that I've been troubled a lot by over the past 10 years is the growing strength that Russia has had diplomatically. It used to be that for the most part of the post-war era, since World War II, countries in the Middle East thought of the United States as stepping into the role of the great balancer that the British used to play earlier. And I think that was a real asset for the United States. That began to change over the course of the past 10 years. During when Netanyahu was last in office, for example, he was more on the phone and more in contact with Putin than he was with the American president. Now that Russia, I think, is not only is on its back feet militarily, it is diplomatically as well. And with the changes coming to the fore now in the Middle East, whether it's a dramatic lurch rightward, apparently, in the new Israeli government coming, the really unprecedented in 40 years internal resistance to the supreme leader, to Islamic theocracy in Iran, new tensions in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. I think this all opens up a huge new opportunity that I hope the Biden administration is able to take advantage of, to once again put us more in a position of being able to balance among these competing forces in the region. And finally, geopolitically, just a tribute to Anne-Marie's writings. I think her work on the question of international networks over the past few years has been some of the more interesting scholarship on international relations. I wonder, I'll be curious if she has time to comment on it, what are the implications of the Ukraine conflict on that thinking on the importance of international networks. On the one hand, as we have basically shut down diplomacy, people-to-people exchanges, business exchanges with Russia, do those networks even exist anymore? China, we're moving into increasingly towards technological, if not full economic decoupling. Does this, in fact, diminish the importance of networks in terms of running geopolitical trends? Or are there new networks emerging? For example, the convergence we see between the populists that you mentioned, John, including in our own democracy, and Putin's interests. Is that a new kind of network that's a sign of this battle between autocracy and democracy that the Biden administration's national security strategy identified? Something definitely worth watching. Thanks.
Populist International, maybe. Steve Moll's making my job a little easier. Well, Anne-Marie, if we could just, I'll take advantage of what he just did. I think he just called on you to talk about transnational networks and so on in light of this war. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. And Steve, it's lovely to be sitting around at least a virtual table with you again. This war has severed educational and commercial networks, above all, dramatically. I don't think anyone expected, based on the way we responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, no one expected that U.S. business would essentially pull out of Russia. Companies like McDonald's and Pepsi, a tremendous amount of business that had been built up since the 1990s. So during the Cold War, we always said, there was really almost a complete break between the West and the Soviet Union. There was very little interaction. There were confidence building measures and some scientific exchanges, but that now it was really different with both Russia and China. There have been very dense networks. Those corporate networks are going to take a decade to at least to start building up again. Because the sort of knock-on costs of pulling your business out and then going elsewhere. And of course, the energy networks, which we might not think about, but those intensive oil networks have just energy in general. And then also, an awful lot of the Russians who we would like to see play a prominent role in Russia have left. But they are coming to sanctuaries in the West, but an awful lot of them now are in Kazakhstan or Georgia. And so we're not maintaining those ties in the same way as well. That is, I think, a real problem in terms of going forward. That's also happening with China, although not to the same degree. I mean, we are decoupling, but there's still plenty of ties between China and the United States. But here's why that's such a big problem. The National Security Strategy, issued 2 weeks ago now, is really historic in the way that it says that global problems, climate change, pandemics, terrorism, food security, water insecurity, those global challenges are just as important as geopolitical rivalry. So that's the administration saying climate change is just as important as the war in Ukraine or the rivalry with China. But you cannot address those global problems unless China, and to a lesser extent, but still important, Russia, are on side. So in destroying these networks, we're actually undercutting our own ability to meet the challenges that they're slower, but they're just as grave. Climate change is an existential threat. And I'm quoting Bill Burns, the head of the CIA. So that's where you would prefer to see this network world as opposed to the chessboard world of states, really strengthening those ties so that you could get all actors in all countries working on those challenges.
Thank you. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that Thomas Riese is also on the panel. He's another expert, and he's raised his hand. Good. So he's another world expert on this question of transnational networks and international politics. So Thomas, thoughts? You clearly have some thoughts already. Please share those with us.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on these on the populist international.
Yeah.
And the populist transnational networks. Yes, it is true that over the last 15 years, we can see these, particularly the right-wing populist movements who were usually at loggerheads with each other, now really aligning. Interestingly enough, however, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has split them apart again. They are all over the place. The German AfD is trying to mobilize against the sanctions, etc. It doesn't really work out so far. They're promising a very hot autumn, etc. That hasn't materialized yet. If you look at the new Italian government, which is really, I mean, the most right-wing government we ever had in Italy, worse than Berlusconi, etc. The leader is clearly pro-Ukraine. Berlusconi is somewhere, and the third party is clearly pro-Russia. Then, talking about right-wing populist governments in power, we have a huge split now between Poland and Hungary. Okay, when it comes to EU issues, Poland and Hungary always hang together. On Russia and the Ukraine, they're on totally opposite sides. So it's really interesting to observe that these networks have no unified position on the war.
Good, thank you. I want to take us back to something Anne-Marie Slaughter said in her initial comments about how the Biden administration portrays this conflict as one between democracy and autocracy, but so much of the world does not see it that way. And in an earlier session, John MacArthur, who's still with us, was talking on the same theme. And I wanted to bring it back to you, John, because you didn't get a chance to follow up in the last session. And just for the audience, what came up at that point was the tepid, at best, response to the surprise, I think, of a lot of Western governments, certainly a lot of citizens of Western countries, the tepid response to Russian aggression in so much of the world. How do we explain that, the difference? And are there things that the United States and the West can do to shift positions, or is that just not going to happen?
Well, thank you. And as usual, Anne-Marie has said everything better than I could, or more clearly, and very sincerely. I would only echo a lot of what she has just said in connecting the dots between these issues. I just want to state very much for the record, given some comments that were made, I do believe one can stand up against autocracy, especially violent autocracy, while paying attention to other issues as well. And what we need to do is not, save the patient's heart while cutting out the lungs. We do need to walk and chew gum in these international affairs, but we actually need to do much more than that. We need to play basketball. We need to play grass hockey. We need to do everything that's needed, because it's a big world with 8 billion people, and there's a lot of interests out there that are different from those of any individual countries. So I think one of the big questions is while there's an essential need, in my personal view, to stand up against violent autocracy, one needs to know how it looks to others if one plays the game of white hats and black hats in the narrative. And we've seen this in country after country after country. The example of Mugabe comes up, who I think we would broadly recognize as a thug, especially in his last years. He was also understood as one of the people who stood up most strongly against the most violent government of repression to fight for his country's independence. And so if you look at him and talk with him, or talk publicly about him without understanding that, you don't understand how to be effective in fighting against autocracy. And so there's an effectiveness question. And I think part of the effectiveness question, if you're on a developing or emerging economy side, is, how much you care about my issues. My livelihoods of my people are my national interests, just like yours are of your national interest. And one of the things we're seeing with climate, in a way that even I, as someone who thinks about this some, has really woken up to, we've had so many debates on climate as a future cost question. So many economies are now seeing this as a present cost question. You know, Prime Minister Motley of Barbados is in many ways the leading advocate of, countries in the Caribbean, by some estimates of the IMF, 5% a year of GDP they're losing due to storms. That means that in 20 years, their entire debt stock is due to storms, many of which are caused by climate change driven by other countries. So this changes how you look at the world. And when the rich countries are able to borrow 10% of GDP at the drop of the hat, but all the international institutions are saying, cut back, cut back, cut back, poor country, you need to have more austerity. It doesn't feel fair. And so then, just to add a bit, we have Pakistan, we have so many countries that are facing these existential crises in the moment. And then we have a country, and I just want to say it plainly, the United States played a crucial role in launching the Sustainable Development Goals globally back in 2015. The United States is the one G20 country that has not put forward and followed through on its commitment to say how it's doing on the Sustainable Development Goals 7 years later. People notice that. And they say, why do you say you want to talk our language, but then when you help agree the language, skip the language? And these are issues that are of consequence, and people follow the resources. They say, oh, you won't use the words, but you're putting money to that, but you're not putting money to this. And I think the notion of where the resources go is ultimately a big test. And the advanced economies, I would argue, need to think much more strategically about where they're investing in global challenges, because that's what the rest of the world is looking at. Very final quick point, I'd say, the UN Charter, there's something I learned recently, and again, someone like Anne-Marie in the room and others, I hesitate to say, but paragraph 27.3 of the UN Charter is getting renewed attention. This is as a campaign, it's about countries that are protagonists in a conflict should abstain. It's actually in the Charter. The lawyers can have a field day on what defines a protagonist, but this is an effort that is underway to even maybe reconsider, how we think about neutrality in the world at the highest level of geopolitics that might actually open up space to deal with some of these other questions more strategically too. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, John. This is an important line of inquiry, this, the common interests that all countries have concerning climate change. You also mentioned just resources more generally. So poor countries have been getting investment from China and some from Russia, and this doubtless influences the way they think about this larger issue. I want to call us back though to what's on a lot of minds now. It was on minds before the war started, but is even more so now. And I'm going to use the phrase Cold War. Thomas is in Potsdam, so I think I'll use that as an entree into the Cold War. So, this is in the eye of the beholder to some extent, but are we in a Cold War, we, the West or the United States, with China or with China-Russia? If not, are we on the way? Does the war accelerate that? Is that the wrong way to think about this relationship? I want to start with Patricia, who thinks about Chinese foreign policy a lot, writes about it. What do you think about this question? Because we are hearing this phrase more and more, I think.
Well, thanks very much, John. I think this question follows really well from the conversation that we were just having in the room. And I think there is indeed a competition of models going on today, a competition between democracies and autocracies, although framing it that way, I don't think is constructive. But with all of the challenges that countries are facing in the world today, from the pandemic to inflation, wealth gap, racism, political polarization, unsurprisingly, there are questions about what kind of political system best addresses these challenges. So here in the US, our country has long made the case that despite its flaws, a democratic system delivers the best results while protecting individual freedoms and ensuring citizens can keep their leaders accountable. In Beijing, Xi Jinping has made the case that absolute control by the Chinese Communist Party with himself at the apex of the system is the key to a prosperous China as it faces turbulent times. So this was in fact a key theme, if not the key theme of the 20th Party Congress. Now, does this mean that Beijing is out to spread its authoritarian model kind of the way that it wanted to spread communist revolution around the world during the Cold War? I don't think it's quite exactly the same. I think Beijing is eager to show off China's model and its successes. It wants to see a world that's safe for autocracies, where everyone essentially agrees not to comment on human rights abuses and repression in other states, and where everyone can just agree to simply do business with each other, or as China puts it, focus on development. And, you know, I think this argument resonates with many countries, especially countries along the democratic spectrum or who are not democratic. Beijing has rallied states to oppose Western, what it says is Western monopolization of what democracy is, a Western definition of human rights. It has opposed what it calls long-arm jurisdiction by the West if it sees human rights violations in other countries. And I think this puts it squarely in line with Russia and other non-democratic states who would find a world free of scrutiny as more preferable. And so I guess my final point is that while there is indeed a contest between democracies and autocracies, and you know, whether this means we're in a new Cold War, that's a broader question. Of course, with economic decoupling underway, I think we are moving closer to that kind of very stark divided world. But I think instead of putting the focus, as many in the room have already noted, on drawing stark lines between democracies and autocracies, I think trying to frame this as a positive contest in which the US really puts a focus on demonstrating through our performance here at home that democracy does deliver, that it is indeed a better system despite its flaws, rather than, again, dividing the world up into categories, is probably a more constructive direction. I think the world will notice when we're doing well, and the power example goes very far. I've heard this when I've gone on trips to Africa and places where China is pouring in a lot of money. They're very eager for this kind of investment and infrastructure. But you know, what I always heard is that we also admire American soft power, the American system. If we had a choice of where to study, we'd rather go to the US than to China. I mean, you hear that over and over. Whether that kind of positive image will last, especially given, you know, this, just very frankly, the state of where our country is an open question. So I think putting the focus on being a positive example, on a positive competition, would be a more constructive direction.
Thank you. I want to follow up, Patricia, if I could, and drill down into one specific question that also keeps coming up, and that is Taiwan. The Chinese, no doubt, are studying very closely the Western response to Russia, Ukraine. In your reading, has the war shifted Xi Jinping's thinking about Taiwan, a timetable about how to address the long-term problem, the Taiwan question, or not?
So yeah, this is, you know, a really big question that I get asked all the time. And I guess my initial answer is the war's not over. So we can't say, you know, these are the definitive lessons that Beijing or any of us will take away from it. Obviously, the war has demonstrated, not just to Beijing, but everyone, that you really can't be sure how a war will unfold, that military superiority doesn't necessarily mean that you will prevail quickly when you're up against a group of people who are fiercely determined to protect their homeland and their independence. I don't think Putin expected his so-called special military operation to pan out in this way. And so hopefully this dampened growing Chinese confidence about sort of its military superiority in the Taiwan Strait. But the glass half empty view is, of course, that this is added urgency on further strengthening the PLA's capabilities. Beijing has surely watched the global campaign to isolate Moscow as well, with, you know, many Western businesses voluntarily pulling out, countries taking steps to reduce reliance on Russian energy and so on. And I think these developments have only confirmed Xi's warnings that he's been making for years, that China needs to become more self-reliant that it needs to erode Western dominance over the global financial system, reduce its vulnerability to Western sanctions. It's just kind of reinforced these messages. And finally, I think I do want to put a light on the fact that Beijing has actually been the staunchest voice for making the case that Ukraine and Taiwan are not the same. And its argument is that Taiwan is not a sovereign state, and it has accused the United States and the West of adopting a double standard, that is, calling on China to uphold the principles of state sovereignty and territorial integrity on Ukraine, but at the same time violating China's sovereignty by supporting Taiwan. That's the way that they make the argument. And this is exactly why Beijing has worked really hard over the last 70 years to get states around the world to recognize its one China principle, so that if and when there is a fight over Taiwan or some, crisis in the region, God forbid, China can have the diplomatic upper hand. And then just final point, I think Taiwan is learning from the war as well. I think for many Taiwanese watching the situation in Ukraine, at the same time experiencing China's military exercises this August after Speaker Pelosi's visit, this has certainly really increased the already high threat perceptions of their fate. It's been a sobering experience, and there's more sort of steps being taken to make sure that Taiwan is prepared militarily. I think Taiwanese leaders have also realized how important it is to make the case, just as Ukraine has very eloquently, that a Russian attack on Ukraine is not just about Russia and Ukraine, but it's really about an attack on democracies. And that's the way Taiwanese leaders have framed of Chinese aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I think it's been effective in raising awareness and especially in Europe and in key capitals in Asia.
Thank you. Now I saw Dale Copeland's hand up. Please, Dale.
Yeah, I want to follow up on Patricia's great remarks, because I think it begs this larger question: what does China really want? Does it really want an all-out authoritarian struggle against democracies that would obviously be a form of Cold War? Does it want to decouple or at least create such self-sufficiency economically that it goes back to something that the Soviet Union had by the early 60s, which is essential autonomy economically, autarky really? Or does it want something in between? And here's where I think we've been led off track by thinking of the international order as a single thing. I think there are at least three separate international orders that may overlap but may not. One is the political order, which is sort of the ideological one of democracy versus authoritarianism. That was clearly in the Cold War. The second is the economic international order, which is how much trade is are the great powers doing with each other. And China and the US are still very coupled, higher levels now than they were even 3 years ago of trade. And China has now the EU as its largest trading partner. China wants that economic order, that economic coupling to continue, but it wants more self-sufficiency in certain areas of vulnerability, like energy and chips and so forth. So that's an important thing, because it does beg the question whether the political and economic orders overlap enough now that we can keep this cooperation on economics going. And now here's where I think Patricia's got a really good point. One of the things that China is very wary about is having a conflict in East Asia, say over Taiwan, that would lead to even half the level of sanctions against Russia being imposed on China, because China is very vulnerable. It can't get raw materials. It imports 75% of its oil. It's not like Russia, and therefore would be really hurt by the kind of sanctioning that the US and the Western allies could do. So what does China want? I think what it wants is to be left alone, to be not told that it had, and get the US out of trying to create a liberal world international order along the lines of John Eikenberry's recent Foreign Affairs article, and avoid this sense that, like in the 80s, the US is trying to create another Tiananmen Square, which was very, very upsetting to the Chinese. So I'm not defending Xi at all. What I'm trying to understand is, again, this spiral effect that I was talking about, this interaction between Xi's economic expectations, his political expectations, and how these can spiral upwards. And he sees bigger threats than maybe we're actually trying to create. And we see huge threats, of course, by China responding in certain ways to build its navy to protect its commerce, but it looks like a threat to, the Pacific. So what I'm trying to do here is be a little bit more nuanced on what we mean by order. And remember that in the Cold War, the political and economic orders were completely overlapping. We totally cut them off economically through COCOM, and politically we were in a big ideological fight. I don't see the economic orders decoupling except at the chip level. And I don't see the political order as necessarily being an all-out ideological fight, precisely because they can't promote revolutions around the world because they're actually in bed, or at least let's say they're cooperating with other autocratic leaders. So it's a different form of ideological conflict. It is not a new Cold War, and she is not a Stalin.
Thank you, Dale. I see hands on the Zoom call. Anne-Marie Slaughter, over to you.
I know we're running out of time, so I will keep this short. And Dale, it's great to hear you. Dale was a graduate student at Chicago when I started my career a long time ago. Dale, I love this. And it's really Joe Nye who talked about three-dimensional chess. I've written a book called The Chessboard and the Web. Joe's point was always there were three chessboards. There was political, and he put military in there. There was economic. And then there was transnational, that was the third arena of world politics. And I think the frame is very helpful, because as we think about the war in Ukraine, there will probably be there'll be a political military settlement of some kind. There will be a lot of economic consequences. And again, and this is what John MacArthur was saying, the economic consequences of the inflation in Europe, but also now being exported to the rest of the world, the food insecurity and the energy insecurity and rising energy prices has a huge impact on low and middle income countries' economies. So it's really turbulent in the economic order. And then finally, I would just repeat, in many ways, one of the greatest costs of this war is the amount of time and resources, not to mention that we're now pumping more oil, but that it is taking away from an existential threat that can swamp all of us, and it really won't matter who wins this war.
Thank you. Thomas Riese.
Yeah, this really follows up now. First, I really think the Cold War analogy doesn't work for the reasons that has been mentioned. Number one, we can talk about decoupling both on the Chinese side and on the Western side as much as we want. We will never reach this decoupled situation that we had during the Cold War, not without ruining both the Chinese economy and the Western economies. Okay, so that's completely off. Secondly, thinking about a new global Cold War between the West and China overlooks the rest of the world. Okay, if you go to Brazil, Argentina, if you go to South Africa, I mean, this has been mentioned before, they will not be part of this. And they can, by now, we are no longer in the 60s and 70s. This is a bizarre, in my view, a bizarre discussion that we're currently having, as if we can sort of control still, our part of the world. That's no longer the world we are living in. And my third point is that comes back to, we have some overarching global commons issues. I mean, climate change was mentioned. I do not see how we can, I mean, I'm desperate by now about the United States, but I cannot see how we can tackle climate change without China. I don't see how you want to do this. Yeah, we need India. I mean, this is a global commons issue that is now really hitting us. It's hitting us big time, and it's getting. I mean, Pakistan was mentioned already, but you can see it in Europe. You can see it pretty much everywhere. So let's not talk ourselves. Yes, there will be strategic competition with China. Absolutely. Totally. I mean, there is a democracy versus autocracy dimension in it. I completely agree. But the Cold War analogy, in my view, does not work and should not work. Sorry for this passionate.
No, no, it's most welcome.
Potsdam, okay,
Mo-
we know what a Cold War is.
But from Potsdam, right, live. It's most welcome. Alan Lynch, over to you for a quick
Just
comment.
very quickly, the issue of climate change cannot be resolved without the collaboration of China, correct? It also cannot be resolved without the collaboration of Russia. And the reason for that is that the Russian boreal forest is actually larger than the Amazon rainforest and plays an enormous role in terms of mediating solar radiation on planet Earth. And it has all kinds of ripple effects of its own, including the 2/3 of Russian territory that are currently based on permafrost and what happens when that begins to subside. So I just note that climate change cannot be resolved without Russia's collaboration as well.
Good, thank you, Alan. So this has been a superb session. I really want to thank the panelists and those in the room. You've highlighted a number of things for us, including both the benefits and the limits of historical analogies and how the world today is not the world of 1948, notwithstanding the importance of the war, and it is extremely important, catastrophic event locally, but the world, there's a lot going on in the world, and there's a lot of continuity in the world as well, notwithstanding the war. So I'm going to hand things over to Bill Antholis now to close us. Thank you.
Well, let me also thank this panel. It was terrific in all regards, giving us a great view of not just the world from the top down, but the bottom up, the combination of networks and complications across parties, across Europe and around. And then obviously the huge question of China, which is one that we take very seriously here at the Miller Center. One of our bigger conferences later this year is going to be on US-China technology cooperation and competition. Our Stevenson, our other major diplomatic conference, will be in the late spring on that topic. I want to thank all of the panelists, moderators, and war room participants. When we have our war room meeting every week, we only get an hour of this every week. Getting 3 hours of it has been a real pleasure for me, at least, but I can tell from the conversations in between breaks that others really came to appreciate the depth, complexity, and value of having these kinds of multidimensional conversations on this conflict. And so I really appreciate you all bringing it, not just being here in person for the ones able to, but those of you who are able to join us by Zoom. We hope to get you all here in person soon. Anne Marie, I'm sorry I'll miss you this weekend, but I know we'll connect again soon on one of your visits or one of my visits up there. I also want to thank the Miller Center team. Enormous amount of work went into this session, even the weekly Zoom sessions where we've been having guests drop in, has been a lot of work. And so particularly for Christina and Alfred, who did the lion's share of work on organizing the speakers for today, but then the logistics of today, our whole AV team, Reed, and everybody else here at the Miller Center that puts this together. Huge amount of thanks to you all. And finally, our governing council. We start our governing council meetings in just under 2 hours. A number of you were able to be here with us in person. And then you're going to stay on for another day worth of meetings. So great thanks to you for all of your support. And then finally, to the Battle family, we know you're out there. We're sorry that you're not here with us in person this year. But as Anne Marie said, Bill Battle's legacy is great here at the Miller Center. It goes back to the founding of this organization. And we're really appreciative that once again, we were able to put together such an important conference. And of course, the Marcus family, who continues to support these efforts as well. So thank you all. One small programming note for the panelists. There will be panelists and participants in the conference and governing council. There will be lunch served down in the library. So please make your way down there when we end this, and the governing council meeting begins at 2:30. So thank you all.